The unfolding of your words gives light. It imparts understanding to the simple. Psalm 119, verse 130. Welcome to this episode of The Unfolding Light with your hosts, Randy Starkey and TJ Tamer, where we seek to make not-so-simple truth accessible for the simple like us.
Well, hello again. Welcome back. TJ and I have been, I guess you could say we kind of lapsed last week. We both had some schedules going. So I guess you could say this recording of this podcast, Unfolding Light, is not necessarily going to be a weekly thing, but it's our aim to be weekly. But there's going to be times where it's going to be every other week. And I'm going to say an apology from the onset because I'm having a little bit of an audio issue, so you're going to be getting a little bit of a trail of my voice. I didn't have an opportunity to figure out what was going on. But anyway, TJ, how's it going?
Oh, it's going pretty okay, I suppose.
So you've been busy this morning with vehicle issues and taking care of all that, huh?
Yeah, and then I don't even know the days run together because, I'm still at the house. But was it last week that I got the vaccine?
Yes, that's why we didn't record.
Yeah,
You were wiped out.
I was real tired.
You didn't even respond to me. I was like, hey, man, we're going to record this morning, and I got no response from you.
That's because I was sleeping. So if that's at all how you felt, even to a degree, man, I don't want that, man. I was tired. I couldn't hold my eyes open.
No, when I got COVID back at Christmas time, I had a fever for about a day, but it wasn't a bad fever. It was controllable with some ibuprofen and Tylenol, but after that, it was just all about the loss of taste and smell. So that was the worst thing in the world. That was driving me crazy. Now, I don't want to say anything about the people who got it, and they're like, it's a really bad flu, and they felt horrible. I feel terrible for those people, but for me, it was nothing like that. It was just the loss of taste was driving me insane. I was doing some work at the time at my sister's house, so every morning we were driving over to her house, and we'd stop in Maiden at the truck stop and get some breakfast. And my traditional is a liver mush sandwich. And so the first day after I lost my taste of smell, it kind of ruined liver mush for me for a while because it was like eating sawdust. I couldn't taste. It was just, liver mush, I love it. But without the taste, the texture's not the greatest thing.
Yeah, it's not.
So anyway, just kind of maybe circle back to our last recording, just for those who do pay any attention to us. I mentioned at the beginning of our last podcast that I was looking forward to start raising some funds for a pastor's conference in Haiti that Claire Zeus wanted to conduct at the end of April. Hey, look at there, one mission. So that was our planned soccer trip that didn't happen because of the political situation. But anyway, the goal was to raise $1,200, and I hadn't started doing any fundraising at the time, but mentioned it last week on this podcast. And by the end of the day, I had a gift from a mutual friend of ours. I won't name on live because I don't know if he'd want me to, but so we had a donation to cover that plus some. So that was a blessing that I was totally not expecting. So, but anyway, and then just in ties of old mutual friends, speaking of, and by mutual friends, I mean those who were in the youth group when I was youth pastor with, and TJ was one of the youth. Last week as well, on Saturday, I went to a wedding of one of our other youth that was, I guess he was same class as your brother. So
yeah, he's Jeremy's
and
age.
So got to go and just join in and celebrate a wedding as well, and got to stay over and take a Sunday off from here and visit another church. So I got to visit at Redemption Hill in Winston, where another mutual friend of ours is on staff there as one of the staff elders. So it was a good time just to to go sit. I like visiting other churches when I can. The only thing I don't like about visiting churches is, as a pastor, I'm in evaluation mode.
Yeah, it's so hard to
You know what I
not
mean?
be in evaluation mode.
Yeah, you're looking at, because I'm kind of going in, because I'm always thinking about, from our church perspective, how do we do things better, more effectively in every respect. Obviously, our focus is being biblical, bottom line, but just in the touching points, like, when we got there, of course, we knew some people, so we talked to some people there, and then we went in, and I don't know if I should say too much. I don't want to be. It was a good time. They were doing a great job there, but it was a different church than I'm accustomed to. Many people would love this church, but I remember
Did they have that
one of the
that church plant feel? Is that a nice way to say it?
Yeah. It had a church plant feel. I guess I'm not sure exactly what that means, but I mean, it was a metal building, but it was well laid out. It was really cool. It was modern. The worship area space was small, but I just remember looking up across the ceiling, and I looked at my wife and I said, "Look right there." I said, "They got more than a year worth of our budget hanging from the ceiling right there." And I mean, they had all. I'm like, I don't know how they do it. I mean, how does a church plant? And I know they were like about 5 years old, but like, where did they get all that money from? Because, like, I mean, seriously, the lighting alone is more than, I guarantee you, is more than a year's budget in my church. And
could have been donations from other churches.
And that's what I figure, that some funding come in through some donors. But it was interesting. I mean, again, all in all, there's nothing bad to be said about the church, and that's not what I'm meaning in my personal experiential evaluation. But I remember sitting down, and of course, once we got in there, not trying to be negative here, but other than the people that we knew, no one spoke to us. I did take note of that, because I'm always on to my people about when visitors come. If somebody doesn't come back to our church because too many people talk to them, then so be it. But I don't want it to be because, they were just kind of left off to themselves. But I looked around, and I realized I'm surrounded by mostly 20-somethings.
Yeah. Maybe
into the early 30s, by and large, apart from Mike and Marie Cannon, whom you know. Mm-hmm. They were there, and they're very sweet people. So I'm looking at that, and we're sitting, and then the music starts, and the band was fabulous. They were good. But I'll have to be honest with you. I mean, it's just, the music's fine. Well, no, it wasn't too loud.
Oh, okay.
But it just wasn't it's just my cup of tea, because, I looked up on the stage, and I told my wife, I said, it looks like a bunch of Aubreys up there. And for those who know my son, you'll understand that. So
that's the feel today, man. That's what
the piercings,
wants.
The tattoos, the tight rolled pants, tight whatever you call.
Pants.
Yeah, you don't have the piercings either. No. But anyway, it wasn't any of that. I get, that's not a hang up for me. It's not my thing. But right in front of me was the bass player, and above him was the screen for me to look at. Well, I'm sure the bass player is a great guy. I didn't talk to him, didn't meet him, so I'm not trying to evaluate him as a person, but he was a distraction to me. I mean, his gyrating and dancing, and, and again, that's not to be negative about him by any way, but it distracted me, and it reminded me of the fact that whatever we do in my approach to ministry, I don't want anything to be the distraction. And so, again, I don't want to take away from this guy's experience of worship, on himself, because hopefully if he's leading worship, he's worshiping. I don't want to take away from that, but he was right in front of me, and I couldn't not see him, because otherwise, other than close my eyes and, and not read the words on the screen. But that I did take note of that. And then I remember at one point in the service, the guy who spoke that day was one of the elders. I don't think he was one of the full-time staff elders, but I think he's like part-time or something like that, probably about my age. And he came out, and his first kind of thing was, he was like, "Hey, yo, what's up?" And I just remember it because my wife looked at me. She was like, "What was that?" And I looked at her, and I said, "Honey, look around." And I said, "What's visibly missing?" And she looked at me like, "What are you talking about?" And I was like, "You've got the grayest hair here." And And my point was, he was saying what he said, because I mean, you look across the room
That's
at
who he's
20
talking to.
somethings and early 30s, but it also, and again, the guy was good. He did a great job. Acts 27, walking through a massive narrative. I thought he did a fine job. Um, but one of the things that Jennifer and I were talking about afterwards, I kind of said, I guess for me, and again, I'm not like trying to say this was right or wrong, but for me, when I look at that, I realize that the way we approach connecting with people is we tend to try to go to where they are, and that's not always wrong, but it's not always right, in the sense that, I know we pull scripture out and say, Paul said, "I became all things to all people, so that I might by some means save some," and we take that and we mean like, in this case, so a 45-year-old trying to be hip and cool like a 20-something, and I get that. I spent my time trying to do that, right? But I was much younger. But my point was this: if the 40-somethings try to be the 20-somethings, then who's going to show the 20-somethings what it looks like to be a mature, stable, experienced Christian at 40-something? And my point was, we're not supposed to be them. I'm not supposed to necessarily, and it's not all about looks or all that, but I'm not supposed to try to be like the 20-somethings in order to reach the 20-somethings. Because when I read the scripture, and I don't, and I'm sure if you talk to Redemption Heal, they have a plan. They're very intentional. They're very strategic. They're great guys. But one of the questions I would most certainly have, and I look across here and I see you guys are doing a great job reaching this generation, and I want to say, hallelujah, because I want to reach that generation too. But at the same time, I'm looking out and I'm going, but how do you in this context do the older men teach younger men, older women teach younger women, when my wife, who is 48 years old, 48 years young, and yeah, I'm going to say it on there, and hot. But the I had to put that in there. But how do you do that kind of thing when she, that's absent? And I realize you can't manufacture that. And you have the Mike and Marie, and that's wonderful, and I commend them, because I'm sitting here thinking, Mike and Marie, this isn't their cup of tea. This style, like I said, band was great, but it's not what I'm after. It's more, contemporary. And by contemporary, I don't mean just that it's new music. I'm not opposed to new music by any means. I love especially City of Light. This guy's great. That's new music. That's contemporary music, but contemporary in its styling and its wrappings. And again, the idea is that if we do this, then we're going to be able to reach these people. And I just struggle through some of those things about how we package our contextualization. We call it that. And I know that the intentions and all that kind of stuff are most certainly good. And again, I don't want to come across as like nitpicking Redemption Hill to say they shouldn't do this, they shouldn't do that. I'm not saying that at all. But, I can't help but go in there and evaluate all these things from my context and from what I know, what would a church look like for me if I got to design it from the bottom up? What would the music look like? Would there be a band? Would there be a piano and a person just getting people to sing, and not necessarily what we sometimes have to balance out between worship leading and performance? And you know what I mean there, TJ. So it's a tough balance. What would that look like? What would it look like as far as this? How much scripture reading you put into the service, and confessional type stuff. I'm all for the confessional type stuff, and that's not contemporary. That's archaic. So that's a struggle for me, and I just but like I said, I am objective enough to know that just because this is my goal, my aim for what a church ought to look like, while I do think there are some rights and wrongs, I realize that everything I think is not necessarily the only way or the right way to do something. But what do you think, TJ?
I think you're right. I think so. Since I am not currently in a music or in a worship or in a pastor position or anything like that, I've had opportunity to go to other churches and preach. You're being one of them. And and so it's always interesting when I go somewhere new, which I've been to your place probably 4 times now, so there's a sense of familiarity there. But when I go to someplace new, I try not to, but I try it. Just I evaluate, because for me, whenever I walk into a place or when I go into a place to worship, one of the things that really catches me is, what do they have in the back of the seats? What kind of information is just there for people? Or if they don't have anything in the back of the seats, which is fine, what do they have out in the lobby or in the foyer or wherever that has information that people can get, that's kind of explains what this church has going on? And the thing is that Redemption Hill, being in Winston-Salem, is going to be much more urban than what
Yes.
you and I are in.
That was
And-
very evident and part of my evaluation.
and that's fine. And but even that vibe is very in even in young church. Like, I don't know that you could consider them a church plant. I mean, at what point does they shift from being a church plant to an
I
established
kind of
church?
think 5 years in, you're kind of an established church.
Yeah,
So I would say they're no longer a church plant.
but the church plant that I helped lead worship for a couple weeks over the summer last summer, that was that vibe. Everything was wood. They had the wood panel or the wood or the pallets or whatever everywhere. That was the kind of worship, and they were just much more, I guess, like you said, contemporary or whatever in their presentation of things. And behind all that, their theology was good, and they understood rightly, even if we would do it differently. And so, I mean, one of the things that I want to do is I do want to take a Sunday and go to Redemption Hill. And, I want it to be when Jason's preaching, so that he can, so that we can laugh about how I'm sitting there listening to him preach because of his theological journey, and where we started and then where we are now. And,
Yeah.
and how cool God is with that. But,
Cool God is.
I'm just saying, it's
Is
just,
that's an attribute of God, right? He is cool.
oh, yeah, we're going to talk about God's coolness.
Okay.
At some point. But yeah, I just, I try to turn it off because I want to be able just to come in and do what they tell me to do, and not, not like Alistair Begg and his example in that worship, versus feelings video.
I love
Because
that
that's
one.
not really, I love that one too. But
How do you feel? How do y'all feel today?
yeah, but just kind of, I want to be able to not, and I think what Randy, you said it earlier, and I have to agree with you. Just because I'm evaluating, it's because I'm in the industry. It's not because I question whether or not this church is doing anything good or bad, but I'm in the industry, and so you automatically see differences in what you have or what you would want.
Well,
But
I would
think
argue.
I was just
I
going to say.
would. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was just going to say, if we were to build churches from the ground up, our churches would look different.
Oh, sure, absolutely, and but I would argue the evaluation that's going on in the mind of every person, whether they know it or not. It may not be the paradigms of things like, here's what it looks like when you walk through the door. Who talks to you? Who doesn't talk to you? How easy it was to figure out where you're going, or this or that, especially if you had kids. And those people may not be evaluating on in every category. What's the music like? What's the style? What's the does it distract me? Does it cause me to focus on the message of the song or the band themselves? People aren't necessarily going through that process, but they are. So we should encourage critical thinking on when it comes to even worship. We want to divide worship by the very fact that we know this, because when we talk about a service, we talk about the worship and then the message. We're already doing that. So by worship, we're talking about the music, but we know that's not the case. But
Sure.
we are dividing worship in another sense, like feeling and thinking. Worship is like when we feel and we just raise our hands and sing the songs, and that's worship. But worship is also critically thinking about what is happening and how it's landing and being, expressed, how it's being received, and the truth that undergirds it all. That's worship. And so it's not wrong to be critically thinking about what's going on and what that in itself, because even without a word said, that communicates something.
Yeah, but that's not also, we need to make sure everybody understands when we say that we're not talking about being critical. Like, that's not what we
No,
mean.
no.
And so, because people say critical thinking and they attach critical to a negative, that's not what we mean.
Right. No.
And so,
a thorough evaluation.
sure. But, it's interesting because, since I've been able to do this in different churches, it's all been during COVID. And
Right.
That has completely changed the landscape of. I've been down to another church multiple times, and very few, if any, people have spoken to me, because that's not what we do right now. Like, everybody's spaced out. Everybody comes in, does their thing, and then everybody bounces. And so I have questions revolving around that. And I mean, because these are, I've read articles people have put out and whatever, man, there's going to be some long-term effects, not just in the church, but our entire society has shifted in the last year and a half. Yeah. And this is going to be felt, and maybe not, it's not all bad, but there's also some stuff that is not great that is going to be felt for a while to come, that may shift the way that, in a bad way, may shift the way that people are connected. And so I'm interested to see what happens when they, I read an article today that said, based on the officials or whatever, by the spring and summer, you're going to start seeing these things more. By the fall, kids are going to be back in school full time pretty much everywhere, and you're going to see this thing start to really get back to normal. So then I'd be interested to see what happens, especially in our industry, and what happens in religious circles. When
Industry.
You don't have the
Always funny word.
excuse. Yeah, when you don't have the excuse, and not that it's excuse like a, okay, maybe excuse is a bad word. When you don't have the reason to stay away.
Yeah, well, I can already see that, there's people, we all know there's people that aren't coming back.
Yeah.
And, sad to say that's the case. But fortunately, we've seen some new people come in. But nevertheless.
Now, do you think those people aren't coming back because they were, okay. Do you think people are not coming back because we'll use the parable of the sower? Okay.
Yes, and no, and no. I don't know. I mean, I know that COVID most certainly had its effects. And you take anybody, especially, I mean, it's not my job to decide, well, yeah, they're not coming back because they're not real believers, or so forth, so on. And it may be the case, but it's not my job. My job is simply to say, they might have been very young spiritually for some cases, and, then I don't know. It's just, I grieve it. But anyway, the one good thing, I can say one good thing has happened from COVID. It's called the unfolding light. This wouldn't have happened. This wouldn't have happened if it wasn't for COVID. I don't think we'd be here doing this. But let's move. We've now had a really long conversation just about churches and evaluation, which is a good conversation to have. But let's turn our attention. I think I'm trying to avoid this because it's going to get complicated. To our subject of today, and our subject
ironically
today is
titled,
the simplicity of God. Now, this is what we call an attribute of God, or something that we seek to pull out and describe of God's character. When we talk about the attributes of God, that's what we're doing. We're taking these packaged thoughts and trying to help wrap our minds around aspects of God. And as we began that, one of the things we do need to remember from the very outset, and we've talked about this when we started this, was our language. We've got to approach these kinds of things with a great deal of caution, even in the words that we use, because our words are finite. Our minds are finite. So when we're taking something that is infinite and massive and beyond our comprehension, and we're trying to define it, our language can move us in a bad direction if we're not cautious about it. And so the grammar that we use as our framework for talking about God, or I'm reading here a quote. It uses the term God talk, our God talk. Well, let me just read this quote. This comes from James Dolezal's book, All Is in God. He makes the comment, this grammar establishes an acceptable framework for our God talk and sets certain controls on what theological proposals we should and should not regard as sound. The goal is not to enable us to comprehend God in some scientific sense or to dispel the mystery of his being. Indeed, classical Christian theism insists upon the absolute incomprehensibility of God throughout its entire formulation. And he goes on and says, our theological grammar functions in part to preserve the integrity of the revealed mystery of God at precisely those points where human reason may be tempted to diminish it in an effort to render God more easily understood by the human intellect. Thus, the irony as we talk about the simplicity of God. And so there's a lot more than, we could talk about on this subject, but we're not even going to break the ice. We're going to kind of like start the crack. But if I can just get that out there, this concept, the simplicity of God in people's minds to think about, I think that a good service has been done. So TJ, before I kind of define that, a thought before we move to defining the simplicity of God?
Yeah, I have two thoughts. First, what you just read basically means that we need to understand that while we use finite human words to describe an infinite God, we are always going to fall short. It doesn't mean that the pursuit is bad, because the Bible tells us to do that. But you need to understand that there are going to be some things that we talk about that there's no good words to adequately describe. And so, like you said, we're just trying to scratch the surface and clearly articulate and explain what it is, because the simplicity of God is a very complex subject, because we are not simple. And when we mean simple, what does that even mean? We have to define even the word simple, because simple to us, we think is stupid or easy.
A simpleton.
Or a simpleton. That is not at all what we're talking about, which we'll get to in a second. But then the other thing was just, we're also, because we're in theology proper now, the God and whatever, but we're going to talk about two different kinds of attributes. This I would consider. Would you consider this one of the incommunicable ones? It's just
absolutely.
Who God. So,
well, and my definition will clarify that in a moment.
Okay, you're going to talk about the two differences between incommunicable.
No,
and
but when if you talk about that, when I define simplicity, then obviously it'll show that this is not a communicable attribute.
So, incommunicable attributes is basically just what does incommunicable means. I mean, not communicated. So basically, what it means is like God's eternity, God's simplicity. We're also talking about God's unchangingness or unchangeability. Immutability. That's the word I was trying to grab. Like his omnipresence, omniscience. These are things that aren't shared with us.
Right.
And then communicable are God's love, God's grace, God's mercy. These are things that are shared to us. And just a quick example of that, Deuteronomy says that his ways are higher than our ways. His thoughts are higher than our thoughts. So that's not shared with us.
That's Isaiah, isn't it?
It might be.
Deuteronomy, you're thinking of Deuteronomy 29
the secret
about
things. The secret
things, yeah.
Yeah, but Isaiah says, that. But then in the New Testament, we love because God first loved us. We know how to love because we've been shared that with God. So all of these things we're talking about, and we'll try to define them if we come across them, which one that it is. But basically, incommunicable is the essence. Even that's not fair to say either, because God is also love. All right, never mind. Go ahead. So
yeah, well, see that therein lies the difficulty that we must approach with caution as we talk about God and try to know Him more. And but with all this, talking about how massive and mysterious and grand and glorious God is, the amazing thing about it is that he's made himself known. And so he's done so through revelation. Obviously, we talk about natural revelation and then obviously specific revelation in the words of Scripture. But we also need to remember as we think about those that as God has made himself known, he's revealed himself to us in ways that we can comprehend. But that doesn't mean that we can fully comprehend God. So, for instance, when the Bible talks about the hand of God, that gives us something that we can relate to, but it doesn't mean God has a physical hand. The eyes of the Lord are everywhere. This is God revealing himself to us in finite language, in finite ways, that we can then begin to just, scratch the surface of knowing him, and that increases. We can know him more and more and more. But I don't believe in all of eternity that we'll ever attain to the full understanding and comprehension of all that God is, because we will always be created beings. Regardless, God will always be God. So
before you say that, I'm glad you said the knowability, because two things. One, we may not ever be able to exhaustively know God, but we can truly know God.
Yes. Yeah, that's a good way to put it. It can't exhaust the knowledge of God, but we can most certainly absolutely know him. We can say this is who God is and this is who he is not with certainty. So we're not here agnostic. We believe there's a power, there's a creator or something possibly out there, but we can't really know him all that well. So I'm just taking note here that my screen here is a little bit off, but sorry, it got me distracted. I'll just leave it. But anyway, it's outside the border.
Hit him with that definition.
Yeah. So, I'm not going to give it like a textbook definition, but when we talk about, let's look at it and think about it this way. We tend to think in these terms, that we're simple and God is complex because he's bigger and better and all those things. That's kind of the way we think about it. But actually, the reverse is true. We are complex. God is simple. And simply what we mean is that God is irreducible. He is not made up of parts. So a simple machine is something that has few or no parts to it. A complex machine is made up of many moving parts and all that. And the more parts you have, the more complex it is. And you think about it. You pull out your iPhone. You think about all that's involved in making up this whole. It's made up of many, many, many parts beyond even my comprehension. Excuse me. But so when we say that God is simple, we're not saying he's simplistic. We're not saying he's dumb. We're saying that he is not made up of any parts. I mean, this is one of the reasons why the heresy of partialism was condemned in the early church when people were trying to communicate and probably trying to do it for good reasons. What we call the Trinity, God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit, and they would try to describe it in a way that defined God as being made up of parts. That's partialism. God is part Father, part Son, part Spirit, and these three together make up God. That's not the case. God is simple. He is irreducible. There's nothing to which you can reduce him down to and say, well, so for instance, when we talk about all his attributes, these attributes are not parts of God. He's not part love, part wisdom, part righteousness, part, every one of these things is the essence of God in his full divinity. This gets a little bit confounded, and so we have to be careful. Again, that's why I'm saying we're just scratching the surface. But let me share this, if I can find this quote, because I thought this was very interesting, because we don't talk about the simplicity of God anymore. But this comes from actually as a Catholic author, F.J. Sheed. I think I'm saying that right. But he says this: a study of what is happening to theology in its higher reaches would almost certainly take as its starting point the attribute of simplicity and show that every current heresy begins by being wrong on that. I mean, think about it. We don't talk about the simplicity of God anymore. This is why a lot of people are going to be confused right now. But if there's any truth to what I just read, then makes perfect sense why the God that many people are trying to serve is not the God of the Bible. At many points, we've diverted away from this and he's saying because we've got it wrong on the simplicity of God, and I happen to agree on this one, that as the basis, this reality of simplicity, while it's complex in its understanding, not having a foundation of simplicity is the starting point of us moving away into heresies, even heresies that we don't even recognize as heresy, because what we end up doing is begin making God in our own image so that we can comprehend him, so that we can control him in a sense.
Right. And so another word that you can think of to help kind of differentiate between the two is not simple and complex, but let's use a synonym, composite. Because
God is
yeah, because composite is made up of multiple parts or elements. So let's go real simple with it. Polyester is what?
Made up of many
it's
mini
cotton.
esters.
It's
Mini
cotton
esters.
and other
Right.
things to make polyester, right? If you have your workout shirts or your nanotech shirts or your Wiccan shirts or whatever, they're usually made up of cotton, polyester, or nylon. And if you take any one of those things away, then it ceases to be
Right.
that shirt.
And that would be defining, so if simplicity is defined by not being made up of parts, so then define what is a part? Well, a part is anything of which, my mind just blanked there for a second, but a part is something that is necessary that without which the whole would not exist. Does that make sense? So it's what you just said. If you take any one little thing, if these made up of 10 parts, you take one out. So wait, let me start again. So if this whole, we'll call it the whole, is made up of 10 parts, and you take one out, there is no longer a whole. It's something other than what it was. It's something less than. It requires all those parts. And that's what we're saying is God is irreducible. He cannot be reduced to any number of parts. We often think of divinity in terms of our modern world and what we see and experience all the time. Like, right now me and my boys are watching the series The Flash, and we think of divinity or God as being just greater, just stronger, smarter, faster. This is what it means. So we almost naturally, inherently, because of our experience in this world, think of godness being defined by being superhuman, so to speak. And that's what the doctrine of simplicity helps us to move outside of, to remind us that we're not talking about the Greek gods here, because think about it, Greek gods, they were just superhumans that possess certain characteristics beyond what we did, whether that be immortality or, can throw lightning from your fist or things like that, or can run faster. But that's not the God that has revealed himself to us, because he's not just superhuman. He's not just better. Oh, he is better. He is stronger. He is faster. He is smarter. But those aren't the things that make him God.
Yeah, that's
those
unconnected
are
to the situation.
Right. Those are not parts of God that come together to make him this thing worthy of being called God. I mean, these are his essence. This is, so when we talk about love as an attribute, I mean, it's his essence. I often use the illustration that, give me a characteristic of water. Give me one, TJ. One characteristic of water. It's wet. So if you take the wet out of water, what do you have?
Ice.
Even that's still wet too.
Sure.
But it's not
smoke.
possible. You can't take the wet out of it and it be water. And so, yeah, and so when we talk about the attributes of God, of any number of them, we're not like talking like if we just took out because people would like to take out the wrath of God and still have all of God and just not have the wrath. And we say, well, why can't he just set that aside and be all these other things and not be wrathful? Well, it's not a possibility because it's part of it's his essence. He is these things. He gives us the defining definition to all these things by his essence.
I thought of it this way, and it's not a one-for-one, because eventually all of our metaphors break down at some point.
Yes, that's why we approach with caution.
Right, and so take this with a grain of salt, and as I mean it on the surface, and that's it. We'll use shirts again. Okay, well, we use colors. Okay.
You've been shopping lately, TJ?
No, I haven't actually, but okay. The primary colors are red, yellow, and blue, right? Okay.
Sure.
So, sure. You don't know, but...
I do know. I'm smart. I'm colorblind, but I still know that.
So green is made up of what? Blue and yellow.
Blue and yellow.
Yeah. And if you have green and you take the blue out, it ceases to be green. Right? So green is composite. So. Green is a composite color between blue and yellow.
I mean, you could take the blue out of it and tell me it's green, and I'd still believe you. But
sure. Well, everybody else would see that it's just yellow now, and so. But the thing is, when I think about this, and we're not talking about like a pie with layers and like God's wrath, God's justice, God's grace, God's eternality cut into a circle. My thing would be when it just popped into my head, and it was, if you think about tie-dye, what is tie-dye? It's the blending of all color, right? But it is itself, like if we were to say, like if you just imagine a circle that says God, and it's tie-dyed, everything, his wrath, his justice, everything is mixed together, and it is the essence of who he is. How are you going to pull one of that out? How are you going to pull some of that out? It doesn't work that way.
Yeah, and just as you said, these all break down because we don't want to even use in the concept of the attributes of God the word mix.
I know, but I just visually get this picture.
I know
of that. That's all I wanted. Don't go any deeper because it breaks down.
And those things are helpful for us to a point, so long as we recognize what you just said, that this is not sufficient to illustrate, because when we take any of these kinds of finite illustrations and try to press them too far, we end up in heresy. We end up making a God that we can comprehend because we think we have to be able to comprehend in order to know. That's not the case, and so we must, again, approach with caution. Let's move this forward, because this would be like a 3-hour, we're going to challenge the Just Thinking podcast and go for a 3.5-hour podcast, although those guys are like eons above our intelligence. But anyway, so let me start here. Even though divine simplicity is a concept of God that likely for most people, if you said, well, tell me what the simplicity of God is, they haven't heard this term. And so I would say, first of all, we need to regain this term, this theological term, the simplicity of God, along with several others we'll talk about, like the impassibility of God, the aseity of God, things that aren't commonly talked about. I think that we're losing something by not talking about those. So this was a common way of talking about God for many, many, many centuries, leading up to basically modernity and the rise of science. So that in itself reminds me that, hey, maybe this is something significant that we should be talking about on some level, even while we're confused about it and it makes our heads hurt. We should probably talk about it. So let me read some quotes from some of the early church fathers as they talked about God. Irenaeus, however you choose to say that one, in his Against Heresies, he says this, speaking of God, he is a simple, uncompounded being without diverse members, and altogether like and equal to himself, since he is wholly understanding and holy spirit and holy thought and holy intelligence and holy reason and holy hearing and holy WHOLLY, not HOLY, holy seeing and holy light and holy source of all that is good. even as the religious and pious are wont to speak concerning God. So again, even way back when, there was understanding that this is insufficient, but these are necessary ways of us talking about God. Now, my favorite of all times, Athanasius, of whom my son almost got named after, except for my wife wouldn't let me. Here's what he had to say. For God, and this is, before I read it, it's in his work titled Against the Heathen. For God is a whole and not a number of parts, and does not consist of diverse elements, but is himself the maker of the system of the universe. For see what impiety they utter against the deity when they say this. For if he consists of parts, certainly it will follow that he is unlike himself and made up of unlike parts. And then again, in his work titled Four Discourses Against the Arians, Athanasius writes, the divine generation must not be compared to the nature of men, nor the Son considered to be part of God, nor the generation to imply any passion whatever. God is not as man, for men beget passively, having a transitive nature, which waits for periods by reasons of its weakness. But with God this cannot be, for he is not composed of parts, but being impassible and simple, he is impassibly and indivisibly Father of the Son. Now, of course, I got a few more. But let me add in there the one thing in the comparison between complex and simple. When I said we think in reverse, remember, we are complex. You know, we're made up of, obviously, physical, the body. We have emotions. There's so many aspects to us and our many different emotions. All these parts come together. That's why we don't understand ourselves, much less other people, because we are complex, but again, God is not. This one was a new one to me. I don't even know if I'll say this right. Boethius lived 480 to 524. This is what he wrote in his work titled De Trinitate. But the divine substance is form without matter, and is therefore one, and is its own essence. But other things are not their own essence, for each thing has its being from the things of which it is composed, that is, from its parts. It is this and that, i.e., it is its parts in conjunction. It is not this or that taken apart. That, on the other hand, which does not consist in this and that, but is only this, is really its own essence, and is altogether beautiful and stable because it does not depend upon anything. Another favorite, TJ. You, of course, you have these before you, don't you? What I sent to you? Do you have these?
Yeah, I'm looking at them right now as you're reading them.
All right. Well, then, just so this isn't all one-sided, why don't you read Anselm from the Proslogion, one of my favorite works. What could be clearer than this? But Anselm, introduced to me by Dr. David Hogg, wonderful professor of church history. Anselm in his Proslogion, and Anselm lived from 1033 to 1109. So, TJ, will you read that one for us?
It says, for whatever is composed of parts is not completely one. It is in some sense a plurality and not identical with itself, and it can be broken up either in fact or at least in its understanding. But such characteristics are foreign to you, than whom nothing greater can be thought. Therefore, there are no parts in you, Lord. He shifted and is talking to the Lord in this. Therefore, there are no parts in you, Lord, and you are not a plurality. Instead, you are so much a unity, so much identical with yourself, that you are in no respect dissimilar to yourself. You are, in fact, unity itself, and cannot be divided by any understanding. Therefore, life and wisdom and the rest are not parts of you, they are all one. Each of them is all of what you are, and each is what the rest are. And since you have no parts, and neither does your eternity, which you yourself are, it follows that no parts of you or your eternity exists as a certain place or time. Instead, you exist as a whole everywhere, and your eternity exists as a whole always. By far the most.
Do-do-do-do-do-do-do.
I was going to say that was by far the closest, because while you were reading, I was typing out my simple, quote unquote, definition of what all these people were saying, because that is the first one that was leaning where I understand what they're saying, but that was the first one to put it close to where we're going to land in more
Okay.
modern language. Now, obviously, he's 1,000
Yeah.
years before some of these.
Right. So I thought that last statement, instead, you exist as a whole everywhere and your eternity exists as a whole always. I'm like going, whoa, now we're getting into a whole new concept here about, where in time does God exist and when? There is, you can't even use that language. When
Because he exists
did
outside
God?
of time.
Yeah. So see that again. That's just a reminder to me of where we have to begin when we're thinking about God and not trying to simplify Him. That's a different idea there. Simplify Him to our ability to put Him in a box. Finally, as far as quotes go, it doesn't bring us up to the present by any means. I really should have added some of the reformers, although we will get to that in just a moment a little bit. Thomas Aquinas, 1225 to 1274, in his work, Compendium Theology, writes, the first mover must be simple. Let that soak in. The first mover must be simple. For any composite, there's your word, TJ, for any composite being must contain two factors that are related to each other as potency to act. But in the first mover, which is altogether immobile, all combination of potency and act is impossible, because whatever is in potency is, by that very fact, movable. Accordingly, the first mover cannot be composite. Moreover, something has to exist prior to any composite, since composing elements are by their very nature antecedent to a composite. Hence, the first of all beings cannot be composite. Even within the order of composite beings, we observe that the simpler things have priority. Hence, the truth remains that the first of beings must be absolutely simple. There you have it. This is why we maintain, or should maintain, the simplicity of God. I mean, again, there's so much more to talk about that, but the reality that for there to be anything else beyond a simple God, there has to be something prior to make it up. I mean, let's take something fairly simple, a simple machine, a bicycle. All right, a bicycle, it doesn't have a lot of parts, but it has parts, right? It has, obviously, the frame, the body, handlebars, the wheels, the spokes, the chain. Yeah, so, I mean, we can comprehend this, and you take any one of those away, and you don't have a bicycle, you have something that might still, you could recognize as a bicycle, but it's not functionally a whole. Take a wheel off. You don't have a
Forget the wheel.
bicycle.
Take
You have
the
a
spokes off.
unicycle. Oh, okay, take the spokes off. But
then
in
you
order
lose
to...
the integrity of the wheel, so it doesn't function as a bicycle.
Right, but so there's two things that are involved here. Number one, you have the parts, without which any one of them, the whole doesn't exist. But each one of those parts had to be made prior to the whole, right? So, I mean, the wheel had to be made and then brought together with the other parts to make up the whole before you have a bicycle. Take any part away, you don't have the whole. Obviously, you have each one of those parts existed prior. But not only do you have the issue of the prior existence of things, if God is not simple, then there's something prior to God. But you also have the reality that you can have two wheels, a chain, a handlebars, a body, and you can lay them all out, and you still don't have a bicycle. You can have all those parts, you don't have a bicycle. What's required? They have to be assembled. There has to be something or someone that then puts those parts together. So if God's anything other than simple, then we are saying, without saying it, just by saying God's not simple, we're saying, number one, he's made up of parts. And then number two, something outside of God had to bring those parts to act together for the potency that Aquinas was talking about, to work together to create this person, this thing we call God.
And the point being, why does all this matter? We're going to talk about it when we talk about his impassibility and his aseity, his immutability. When we talk about these things, and Randy's basically, what we're saying is we're making this the foundational principle, because if God is not simple, if he's made up of parts, then you can deconstruct him, which means he's not God. If he's not simple, that means something outside of him arranged or assembled these parts to make God, which means he is then not God. If he can change, he's not God. If he can move or react, if he's reactive instead of active, he's not God. That's the whole point. If you try to deconstruct, it doesn't work, and the whole thing is for naught, and we might as well quit.
Yeah, so the reality here, I mean, obviously, when we talk about the simplicity of God, I'm not saying that, hey, if you get this down, you got it. You know the true God. No, this is a foundational aspect that needs to undergird the conversation about any and all other aspects of God. Like TJ said, it's going to kind of come together a little bit more, or maybe get more complex. I don't know. When we talk about his aseity, and when we talk about his impassibility, and then all the things we're used to talking about, his omniscience and omnipotence, his omnipresence, his love, his holiness, so forth, so on. You have what?
I have a definition.
I
wrote it out.
For simplicity?
Yeah.
Let's hear it.
The simplicity of God is such that in everything that he is holy. There's no holy, W-H-O-L-Y. There is no division in him, no parts. He is holy himself always.
All right. You see, you could spend a whole sermon series unpacking that statement alone, TJ. So
you can do everything that he is and spend, I don't know, however many 20 weeks or whatever.
Well, the point is, we're never going to get off this conversation, nor should we ever. And I say this because the very thing that inspired me or motivated me to do what we're doing here is the fact that for me, it kind of was a reawakening to the fact that, we don't know God. We're not talking about God in such a way, even in churches today, that we know God, and it's a scary thing to think that maybe with all our good intentions, with all our passion and love for our Creator, that we are moving people to worship something less than the God of the Bible, our Creator. And so we need to spend some time here talking about some of these very difficult things and pushing people, challenging people, to not quit because it makes your head hurt, because you don't understand it at first, but to press into it and keep pressing into it, and do so with great deal of caution when it comes to the language we use. My wife gets on me all the time, TJ, about picking apart words. Matter of fact, we were driving home Sunday, and Shane called, and he made a statement. It was kind of an inside joke, but my wife didn't get it, and when I explained it to her, she's like, because it was the whole, it was the whole. I don't know if you were in on this one, the praying a hedge of protection thing. Were you in on that conversation in part?
I was. No, we started it on the podcast when I said.
Okay. Yes. Okay. So, but Shane made a joke in that and said about praying a hedge of protection, which is a common terminology. And then my wife was like, "Yes, please do." And when we got off, I was like, "Yeah, it's not biblical." And I was just teasing with her, but she was like, "You get nitpicky." She's like, "Yeah, I can't pick apart every word." I was like, "Yeah, honey, we have to." Not to the point that we're depressed and we're like, give up. But yeah, we should pay attention to words. We should pay attention to how we communicate, because people aren't always hearing what we are trying to say, and it will lead to a belief system. And so we have to be concerned about that. Let me add some statements from some confessions here. We're going to have to wrap this up before long because this could go on for days. But in James Dolezal's book, and I do commend the book to you, All That Is in God by James Dolezal. It's not the only book out there on this issue. Matter of fact, there are more books being written now in presently about the simplicity of God. It's kind of a revival of this kind of language. But James Dolezal is probably the sharpest mind on all things theology proper right now that I'm aware of. But anyway, so in his book, he makes statements: Anglicans, Presbyterians, Congregationalists, and Baptists all confessed that God is without parts. So this isn't new. This isn't something we're just trying to create some terminology and just for a conversation to wow somebody. This is an old conversation that kind of was lost. It stood at the center of the knowledge of God for almost 2,000 years, 1,900 years at least, because it's really about the turn of the 20th century where we saw this kind of dropping out. Then I'm trying to think. I'm looking at my reference. This is from the Belgic Confession, Article 1. It was written in 1561. We all believe with the heart and confess with the mouth that there is one only simple and spiritual being which we call God. That's the Belgic Confession of 1561. There's one only simple and spiritual being which we call God. Let's see. I have a statement here from, I'm going through some of my notes. Yeah, from the Second London Baptist Confession. Now, it doesn't use the word simple. I mean, I like to find the ones where it was very clear and they use that word, but in the chapter 2 of the Second London, under God and the Holy Trinity, it reads this way: The Lord our God is one, the only living and true God. He is self-existent and infinite in being and perfection. His essence cannot be understood by anyone but him. He is a perfectly pure spirit. He is invisible and has no body, parts, or changeable emotions. He alone has immortality, dwelling in light that no one can approach. He is unchangeable, immense, eternal, incomprehensible, almighty, in every way infinite, absolutely holy, perfectly wise, wholly free, completely absolute. And it goes on. I'm going to jump down into the second paragraph of this because it just goes on illuminating those attributes. It says that God has all life, glory, goodness, and blessedness in and of himself. He alone is all sufficient in himself. He does not need any creature. He does not need any creature he has made, nor does he derive any glory from them. Instead, he demonstrates his own glory in them, by them, to them, and upon them. He alone is the source of all being, and everything is from him, through him, and to him. He has absolute sovereign rule over all creatures, to act through them, for them, and upon them as he pleases. In his sight, everything is open and visible. His knowledge is infinite and infallible. It does not depend upon any creature, so for him nothing is contingent or uncertain. He is absolutely holy in all his plans, in all his works, and in all his commands. Angels and human beings owe to him all the worship, service, or obedience that creatures owe to the Creator, and whatever else he is pleased to require of them. So, of course, it's lengthy in trying, we're always trying to simplify our definitions and make them as short and concise as possible, but that's the problem. We can err when we seek to, for lack of better words, dumb things down so that we can understand them. And I get it.
Talking about my definition was immaculate.
Immaculate. I get that we, as those who are supposed to teach, have to find ways to help people understand, but we must approach that responsibility with a great deal of caution as to not make theology, make God, simplistic. We do have to seek to reach to where people are, and that's what God does. When he reveals himself to us, he does so in language that's familiar to us, that we can relate to, but he doesn't leave it there. He uses that to bring us up, to raise our understanding, to help us to attain to a deeper knowledge of who he is. And that's what we must do with, as we're communicating to other people. We've got to reach down where they are. We can't talk over heads all the time, but we've got to utilize some things that will help them to strive for more. And TJ, I just lost your video. I got your audio. I'm going to pause our recording for a second. All right, there we did a quick pause there. I lost TJ for a second, but we are back. And my point that I was making was that we must challenge those that we are responsible to teach to not stay where they are. We reach down there, and so I think part of that means we have to teach them certain grammar of God talk and expect them. And we talked about this early on, just about the certain language that is specific to certain things, like different sports, have their own language. You have to learn the language to understand what's going on, and that is true here. And I think we need to revive, in particular, this concept of the simplicity of God, and we need to bring that word back into our conversations, and then let it grow from there. We start with a good definition, which again, TJ, I'm gonna have you share your definition just again as we get ready to wrap up in just a moment. But we need to regain this idea, this word, start putting it back into our conversations so that we can kind of run backwards to remembering the God that we serve is not like us. He is simple. We're complex. We're complex because we are the product of an amazing, immense, simple, impassable, so forth, so on God, who has always been and always shall be. Again, I've got a whole bunch of other notes here, TJ. This was, I'm just going to add this one, and then I'm going to turn it over to you to kind of wrap us up. This was another quote from James Dolezal's book. If God is composed of parts, which as parts must necessarily be distinct from the fullness of God's being as God, then our confidence in him must look to some source of being prior to him, a reality more fundamental than himself. And so, in essence, if the one we are saying we worship is not simple, then we need to look to something prior to that one that we've been worshiping, and then we need to worship him, because that's God. By our definition of God, that which is prior to all things is the God of the Bible, our Creator. That's the one we're supposed to be worshiping. And the one we worship is, at the very foundation, a simple God. TJ, some final words, and then include in that your definition of simple, and we'll close out with that.
Yeah, so just know that as we've gotten into theology proper, and as we work through these terms that you may not be familiar with and things that we haven't talked about in detail before, just remember that we are not giving you anything close to being exhaustive on the subject. We're just trying to scratch the surface. We're trying to get these thoughts in your mind more. And not only that, but we want to connect it to how we live our lives, because just talking about this is fun. But once we realize that the simplicity of God is necessary for a right understanding of God, then we hope that we'll take this more seriously. And so, like Randy read, James Dolezal, in that last thing, if God is not simple, then he ceases to be God, in which we lose our confidence. Very similarly to when Paul said, if the resurrection did not happen, then we
of all people must be pitied.
Right. And so that's the same thing. If God and everything that we know, because of what the Bible teaches us about God, if it is true, which we obviously believe that it is, then to lose any part of this negates the whole thing. which we then lose our confidence and and should be pitied above all. And so simplicity, there's probably better definitions out there. I tried to jot this down in our language to help us fully understand, but basically it is the simplicity of God is such that everything that he is, which we're all going to talk about. That's what we're talking about. His impassibility, his omniscience, his immutability. These are the things that are part of the everything that God is. His love, his grace, those are all parts. So the simplicity of God is such that everything that he is holy. WHOLY. Holy, these things. There is no division in him, no parts. He is holy himself always.
Yeah, and with that, as we conclude, I'm sitting here reading our bylines, scrolling across the bottom of the screen, making not so simple truths accessible to people like us. So when we use that terminology, we were using it in the modern, everyday sense that we were simple as in not so smart. That's not what we mean by the simplicity of God. So just
that's why English is stupid.
Making not so simple truths accessible to people like us. So our goal today was to introduce you to a not so simple truth about the simplicity of God. And I hope that this conversation and further thinking upon this will lead you to a passion and desire to know the God who has revealed himself to us, but most notably who has revealed himself to us in the clearest way, the most relatable way, in the person of Jesus Christ, because the Word was made flesh and dwelt in the midst of us, and we beheld his glory, the glory as the only begotten from the Father, full of grace and truth. And he showed us, in part, not exhaustively, but who God is. Well, I mean, he did exhaustively because he's God, but our understanding doesn't right. But he did that in the person of Jesus Christ, and then as such lived and revealed the necessity of us living righteously always and only, which we don't do, but he did it for us, and then gave his life on the cross so that you and I would not have to pay the penalty that we fully and wholly, WHOLLY, deserve. And he granted to us in place of our lack of righteousness, our great need for righteousness, he gave us his in exchange for our sin that he paid for, and that by repenting of our sins and believing in the person and the work of Jesus Christ, our lives are completely transformed for all of eternity. That's our prayer for each and every one of us. So we hope that this has been somewhat helpful, at least to get the conversation started. And we'll be back again in a week or two with another episode to address some more about the person of who God is. So until next time, God bless you.